James Bond, Agent 007, licensed to kill. He is recognised across the globe, and as that rather strange concept of a famous secret agent, he is one of pop culture's most popular and enduring figures. Since his first big screen outing in 1962, unsurprisingly the world Bond inhabits has changed a lot, and as a result, his films seem to chart over half a century of popular culture. In a constant race to keep up with the times, Bond's world has continued to be moulded by whatever is currently fashionable, and even what's become unfashionable.
Filthy habit.
Bond is basically a moving sign of the times, but the changes to the films have not just been the obvious ones, such as technology and fashion. I've always thought it interesting that the character of James Bond, who everyone thinks they know, has also changed many times over the years, and not just due to being played by different actors. It's always struck me that some of the films are so wildly different in tone and character, even some that are only a few years apart, that if they didn't all have the label James Bond, then they could be films of completely different genres about totally different characters. There are even some regular patterns to spot, where some of these changes go full circle and after a few years seem to reset themselves and start again. Despite him being the quintessential post-war fiction hero, Bond's makers obviously feel the need to keep tinkering with and altering their valuable property every few years, sometimes even back and forth in repetitive ways. So why does this happen?
Well, everybody needs a hobby.
So what's yours?
Resurrection.
This is why James Bond gets constantly reinvented. Commander James Bond was a 1950s creation of author Ian Fleming, taking elements of the traditional imperial British thrillers he had grown up with, and combining them with Cold War anti-Soviet espionage and paranoia. Fleming's Bond was an upper-class, heavy-drinking, chain-smoking, cruel womanizer, very much never intended as a role model or a shiny hero, but more of an escapist guilty pleasure. He was a nasty professional involved in a nasty business, and by the final book was pretty much an emotional and physical wreck. Fleming packaged his anti-hero in an exciting mix of exotic locations, sex, violence, alcohol, good food, and nice clothes, and in doing so he almost accidentally invented the airport novel overnight. The result was an incredibly filmable concept, seized upon by Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman when forming Eon Productions. Yet in order to begin their planned franchise with their first film Dr. No, the filmmakers wisely realized they would have to adapt this pretty problematic character into more of the universal hero that would ensure financial success. Therefore, the first time James Bond got altered was actually right away in his transition from the books to the screen. Firstly, Bond was internationalized, making him a global hero. The plots of the books usually threatened British interests, and these were upgraded to planet-threatening, and often nuclear, for the big screen. Bond was therefore no longer just a British agent, he now functioned as a sort of international Mr. Fix-It who just happened to be British. The casting of working-class Scotsman Sean Connery deliberately ignored Fleming's image of the traditional English ruling-class hero, reflected by the role's other contenders, including Trevor Howard, Rex Harrison, and David Niven. Connery instead owed more to the rugged physicality of American cinema icons like Humphrey Bogart and Clark Gable. Here was a Bond intentionally constructed as a classless man of the people, whose slightly more transatlantic accent would win over both British and US markets, and place him somewhere between the ruling elite and the working man. Connery subsequently altered the image of Bond to fit his own persona, proving that the type of Bond currently offered always greatly depends on the actor and their established public image. So powerful was his new take on the character that it even altered Fleming's impression of his own creation, and in his next book, he invented a Scottish ancestry for Bond, a rare example of a film series actually influencing the text it originated from. Bond's behaviour patterns were also heavily modified for the screen to be more popular with a 60s audience. More ironic and humorous than Fleming's creation, Connery combined mostly serious playing of the role with comically disarming one-liners to dissolve tension.
I think they were on their way to a funeral.
Overall, Bond's tone immediately became more light-hearted. Moral reflections on his job were replaced by guiltless excitement. Bond's attitude to authority was also changed. While Fleming's Bond was fiercely loyal to his boss, Connery has a rebellious streak from the very start, making Bernard Lee's M into more of an embarrassing fuddy-duddy establishment figure. In fact, the dynamic is almost a naughty student and a stern headmaster.
I've told you about this before. You tell him.
Unsurprisingly, the films mostly retained the book's open, casual sexuality, as it was perfectly in keeping with the liberal 60s and would boost box office success. Yet, while Bond's number of relationships was increased, they were also somewhat softened. While literary Bond verges on a sexual predator, Connery's star persona is warmer and less hostile. In fact, women on screen seem to fall over each other to be available to him. If literary Bond is very much a male fantasy figure, interestingly film Bond is often both a male and a female one. This softening does not excuse the fact that today Connery's Bond still appears horrendously sexist and even violent towards women, especially when wanting information, but believe it or not, in the 60s this was already a big improvement on Fleming's original character. The films also thoroughly depoliticized the book's plots. Fleming's 1950s novels, including Dr. No, mostly feature villains in the employ of SMERSH, the Soviet Union's real early anti-spy organization. However, from the beginning, the filmmakers removed the anti-Soviet SMERSH ingredient and replaced it with Fleming's later invention, the politically neutral Spectre, a global crime organization exploiting both the East and West equally. This tactful decision to mostly ignore the Cold War and not use Soviets as the baddies instantly made the film franchise less political, more escapist, and much more fun for the audience. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, history continued to be rewritten like this by the Bond films, portraying the USSR not as cutthroat enemies of British intelligence, but more like uncomfortable and even comic bedfellows, battling common threats such as Spectre. So straight away, the Bond of the screen began to offer imaginary solutions to real problems. Another example of this was Britain's faded influence in world politics. In the early 60s, crumbling colonial Britain, suffering from a bitter loss of national identity as more and more colonies became independent, took comfort in Eon's fantasy world where globally Britain still stood centre stage and held power overseas. Dr. No comfortingly reinforces the traditional colonial hierarchy and its stereotypes. It contrasts the superstitious local fisherman Quarrel, basically a caricature of the bulging-eyed spooked native who believes in dragons, with 007, the imperial policeman with a no-nonsense professional determination to investigate. And as John Bull's final vigorous incarnation, Bond's remarkable ability to kill foreigners saw him happily through the 60s, making Eon's films an immensely successful form of propaganda for post-imperial Britannia, and the international policeman fixing problems overseas shows no sign of going away. Dr. No had well and truly set the template for the spy film, soon reinforced by From Russia with Love and then Goldfinger, by which time the formula had become a ritual. Goldfinger targeted the family audience through even more humour and a greater lack of politics, and increased even further a larger-than-life, playful Bond, with a story that was even more of a frantic joke than its two predecessors. Its famous Aston Martin full of gadgets was even marketable as merchandise for the kids. After Thunderball, 1967's You Only Live Twice completed the recipe, single-handedly creating the quintessential villain's lair and an arch-enemy in Donald Pleasance's Blofeld, eventually parodied, of course, as Mike Myers' Dr. Evil. With this formula, the filmmakers had somehow balanced Fleming's traditional Imperial policeman, who in Goldfinger apparently can't listen to the Beatles without earmuffs, with its total opposite, a swinging 60s hero of modernization. While in the books Bond's ordinariness is emphasized, in the films more emphasis is gradually given to his extraordinary abilities, as the ritual became an increasingly inflated routine. The bevy of beautiful girls who began to be added to the films almost straight away both celebrates and begins to mock 007's superhero qualities, as the Roger Moore era would soon be doing even more.
My name's Bond. James Bond.
1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service marks the first major attempt to shake up the Bond formula. It came at the end of an era, as Connery had departed after growing tired of the role. Without him, it was decided that the next film's tone should be altered. It should be a more realistic, sensible thriller with less fantasy. Eon wanted to film Fleming's novel as faithfully as possible, including, spoiler alert, the ending where Bond gets married and then Mrs. Bond is murdered. This desire for a more grown-up Bond was also timely. The swinging 60s spirit of Connery's era was being replaced by the disillusion and fear that would soon come to characterize the 1970s. No doubt this was partly why the filmmakers chose this as the next book to film, its downbeat ending mirroring the success of some recent box office hits from the new Hollywood movement, while also offering some deeper possibilities for human emotion. A Bond who was not only tough but could also show his vulnerable side would hopefully inject some emotion and reality back into an overly playful franchise. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is therefore Eon's first attempt at bringing Bond back down to earth, ironically so soon after their initial deliberate spicing up of literary Bond for Dr. No. This can make you wonder, were the films technically parodies of the books from the start? And if they were, was Roger Moore, who is often dismissed as being too comical, actually the only actor to get the joke, and therefore play Bond as such? To replace Connery, Australian commercials actor George Lazenby was selected as the new 007, with household names Diana Rigg and Telly Savalas safeguarding against total box office disaster. This first tricky actor change suffered from a publicity campaign unsure of whether to loudly advertise Lazenby or pretend Bond hadn't changed. One poster even shows a faceless 007. Of course, today, in the era of constant remakes, reboots and reimaginings, Bond's changing face is now just accepted. We are not offered and we don't require any explanation about why he looks and sounds different. Yet in 1969, Connery, who had tailored the role to himself, was a near impossible act to follow. Dialogue mentioning that Bond had undergone plastic surgery to evade his enemies was eventually cut to minimize the public attention surrounding the replacement. And yet, a quip delivered by Lazenby almost straight to camera in the opening scene.
This never happened to the other fella.
Nonetheless, references the change, Eon nervously feeling that they somehow had to refer to Connery, as to so many people he simply was Bond. Footage of Connery's previous adventures is even reused in the opening title sequence, showing villains and girls, but crucially not Bond, and 3 distinct props in Bond's desk drawer, accompanied by each film's theme tune, are included to prove that the film is the genuine continuation of the franchise. Because it is trying hard to do something different, after watching Connery's outings, On Her Majesty's Secret Service doesn't completely feel like a Bond film. For almost the first time, we are given a slightly more 3D character, capable of tenderness, generosity, and ultimately heartbreak. Most notably, 007 falls in love. In what could be seen as Bond's first ever true love scene, he tells Tracy plainly, "I love you. I know I'll never find another girl like you. Will you marry me?" We are also presented with this more human Bond during action. When his ski is shot off during a chase, he crashes and must continue on one, which when compared with Roger Moore's questionable acrobatics on skis a decade later, certainly adds some plausibility. The film's slow and pretty unpleasant deaths of henchmen highlight more than usual that Bond's is a nasty business, and as again in Daniel Craig's first two films, Q's lab deliberately does not appear, shifting the focus away from larger-than-life gadgetry. Instead, the only tools Bond uses are necessity-led inventions he makes himself. The film also has something of a new look, to complement a late 60s thriller, again borrowing certain techniques from the recently emerging New Hollywood movement. Once again illustrating how Bond is a moving sign of the times and will borrow from anything currently successful at the box office. Yet, confusingly, because the film has the difficult task of trying to return to Fleming while also looking bang up to date, it strives to balance this edgy modernity with some creaky nostalgic hallmarks of the franchise to please the Connery superfans. Straight away, the hat worn by Lazenby dooms the film from its beginning by appearing hopelessly outdated, as by 1969 gentlemen's hats were already a victim of changing times, and just a few years later, Roger Moore would soon be performing the same walk in 70s flared trousers. The film also chooses to keep the entire supporting cast the same. Beginning not with Lazenby but instead with Q, M and Moneypenny, the audience are deliberately shown some familiar faces as preparation for the unfamiliar one. Bond's first scene, where he playfully chases a girl in a red car down a coastal road, also see GoldenEye, shows that when introducing a new actor, Eon often reverts to consciously traditional Bond ingredients for safety, before attempting anything different. Through familiar hallmarks, we are therefore led to believe that nothing has changed since Connery. Bond is greeted by Moneypenny as being same old James, only more so. And although Bond's relationship with Tracy does rise above the usual cartoon, the film's second act suddenly seems to lose its nerve, and reverts back to exaggerating Bond's power of seduction, as he literally begins booking hourly appointments to seduce the clinic's female patients. So the swooning bevy of girls, the over-the-top locations, and the cringe-worthy puns legitimizing the violence
He had lots of guts.
are all still present and correct. Therefore, no matter how hard Bond tries to break away from being a cartoon, its very formula dictates that it inevitably becomes just a checklist of its own overblown conventions. Just witness the cleaner heard whistling Goldfinger. George Lazenby's only outing as Bond was the first clear sign that there was some kind of schizophrenic tug-of-war over who Bond should be, a playful comical superhero or a humorless broken assassin, and this would soon become a recurring pattern in the franchise. By trying to bring 007 back down to earth, the film unknowingly began a recurring trend, what author Simon Winder refers to as Bond's Bloat then Purge cycle, where the franchise purges itself with a sensible thriller after every film that gets too bloated or ridiculous that it just cannot trump or parody itself any further. And this pattern does seem to hold up. Each time the Bond series has become too over the top, as I think you can see in You Only Live Twice, Moonraker, A View to a Kill, and Die Another Day, in the following film he is always sent back to basics in a subsequent Fleming-like outing, as seen in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, For Your Eyes Only, The Living Daylights, and Casino Royale. Each of these films is a clear attempt to tone down the fantasy and reactivate the serious parts of the literary character. Often these mini reboots seem to line up with, or are caused by, a change of actor. A new face atop the tuxedo often gives the chance to start again with the character. Meanwhile, this crucially enables Bond's age to remain roughly the same, even as the world around him changes. A Peter Pan-like characteristic crucial to his success and enduring appeal for each generation. As we look at each actor's interpretation of Bond, I think another pattern emerges. A new actor will often begin by playing the character relatively seriously, yet will lapse into a self-parody later on. As the public warm up to the new actor as Bond, and every film feels like it has to top the previous one, inevitably the script and the performance gets pushed into self-mockery. Each actor also seems to start out as a more physical hero and end up as a more technological one, surrounded by gadgets. Then each back-to-basics Purge ushers in the next physical 007, and the cycle begins again. The confused intentions of On Her Majesty's Secret Service partly explain why it underperformed at the box office, resulting in Eon's panicked apology, Connery's return for one last paycheck in the ridiculous Diamonds Are Forever. Now it seemed like trying to return to Fleming's Bond had become a liability, and from now on, the filmmakers would basically just use his titles and rewrite the stories completely, almost as action comedies. Emotional Bond was gone, the frantic joke was back, continuing almost exponentially under Roger Moore. The only time the filmmakers tried to get Moore to copy Connery's ruthless side, in a scene from The Man with the Golden Gun, sticks out like a very uncomfortable sore thumb. Moore himself didn't enjoy filming the scene, and it shows the importance of matching the right tone to the right actor. Learning the lesson that Moore's Bond would only work as a charming gentleman and not as a violent thug, the only way such a character could now be taken seriously was to not be taken seriously. And so Roger Moore's Bond became a watered-down parody of Fleming's sadistic, cruel creation, more Austin Powers than ruthless killer, a comical superhero, even poking fun at the imperialism of Connery's era. Struggling to stay relevant as the world continued to change, Moore's films began to try exploiting emerging trends in popular cinema, starting with funky blaxploitation in Live and Let Die and the kung fu craze in The Man with the Golden Gun. Most notably, Star Wars mania pushed Bond rather hilariously into space in Moonraker, in a plot so outlandish that a mini reboot was instantly required with the much more straight-laced For Your Eyes Only. It's no coincidence that this film opens with Roger Moore visiting Tracy's grave, the filmmakers almost finally admitting after a decade that their most daringly downbeat film is indeed part of the same film series. But other than this, Roger Moore's action comedies continued into the mid-80s, and once again when the character just couldn't parody itself any further, a new face was brought in to help course-correct the tone. Timothy Dalton, the most aggressive return to Fleming's physical Bond yet, attempted to cancel out the humour with a tough, cold man doing a nasty job. Just as Moore had been a reaction to Connery, now Dalton was a reaction to Moore. Bond's sexual partners were reduced due to the AIDS crisis suddenly making a playboy seem irresponsible, while the violence was increased to compete with the likes of Die Hard and Rambo. Most noticeably of all, the comedy was almost totally absent, and the audience's negative reaction showed that the pendulum had perhaps swung too far too quickly. It's strange that if Dalton's era had come at a different time, he could have been the most popular Bond of all, as 2 decades later, Daniel Craig was praised for bringing back almost exactly the same qualities of literary Bond. But as the character was heading backwards towards the 50s, the world was heading forwards to the 90s and the end of the Cold War, and what possible use could an outdated spy be of now? By the early 1990s, James Bond was in trouble. With the dawning of a new post-ideological global era, the early Bond films suddenly looked like archaic museum pieces. In the first ever instance of Bond being forced to update primarily for ideological rather than financial reasons, GoldenEye was the most conscious and deliberate rebooting of the franchise since it began, bravely relocating a new 007, Irishman Pierce Brosnan, to the 90s. After Bond had basically ignored the real Cold War for 3 decades, GoldenEye rewrites history yet again, suddenly redefining Bond as an ex-Cold Warrior, emerging fresh from battling Soviets in the 80s, around about the time they were actually awarding him the Order of Lenin in Roger Moore's last outing. Clearly, only once the conflict was safely over could Bond be shown to have participated in it. So to suit changing political times, it seems that Bond not only alters real history, but also his own. Villain Alec Trevelyan begins the modern film's recurring theme of a less black and white enemy already existing within the hero's system, but he still has the token, rather un-PC, physical deformity of classic Bond villains, again highlighting the series' constant agonizing over how much variation should replace the standard repetition. By its climax, the film cements the modern trend of freelance villains, unmotivated by ideology, but instead by greed. Bond himself follows suit, preferring private vendetta to duty, a theme which Daniel Craig continued by going rogue in almost every film. In this new world, it seems that Bond now often has to go on personal missions. While in the 80s Bond declared, "for England," by the 90s this has become, "for me." Back at MI6, Moneypenny, another moving sign of the times, now finally threatens sexual harassment instead of welcoming flattery. And in perhaps the biggest change to Connery's world, Bond now takes his orders from a woman. Judi Dench's formidable boss cleverly reframes 007 completely, and is a far cry from earlier females. In fact, in the modern films, Bond often teams up with an independent woman as an equal crime-fighting partner. The script preempts any awkwardness caused by such changes by simply laying them in the open.
I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War.
Point taken.
Ouch. There's never been such an accurate blow at the Bond formula, and for a successful update, the film could not afford to be any less self-knowing. The main effect of lines like this is to diffuse any possible objections by showing that the filmmakers are aware of them. Interestingly, the level of emotion that Dalton brought to the character is partly maintained by Brosnan, who is occasionally depicted as being an unknowable loner. Occasional humour and serious action made GoldenEye a far more successful attempt at rebooting the franchise than Dalton delivered, offering just enough elements of both the playful and the serious Bond to satisfy fans of both extremes.
Beg your pardon? Forgot to knock.
Despite retaining much of Bond's classic heritage, Brosnan's era also saw Bond reinvented as the ultimate modern technological hero. This continued into the 2000s with uninterrupted technological Bond, the gadgets becoming ever more over the top. But once again, in order to survive, the franchise would be forced to change direction completely. The Bourne Identity, released the same year as Brosnan's gadget-swamped Die Another Day, almost single-handedly redefined the spy movie overnight as a telling mix of brute force and emotional resonance. Combined with the wickedly accurate Austin Powers films, which in the late 90s had begun exposing the cracks in Eon's beloved formula, Brosnan's increasingly CGI-aided Bond suddenly appeared decidedly tame. Added to this, A post-9/11 world surely now needed more murky ambiguity and demanded a colder, more brutal response. After an overly technological Bond, it was time once again for a physical hero, relying not on implausible gadgets, but on improvisation. Daniel Craig, whose tough, ruthless persona had recently been forged in films like Layer Cake and Munich, was chosen to play a refreshingly physical 007 who would be sent back to basics like never before. Eon had finally gained the rights to Fleming's first Bond novel from 1953, Casino Royale, which allowed the filmmakers to go full circle and literally begin again. The film functions not only as the latest back-to-basics Purge by returning to a serious Fleming-like Bond, but it also serves as that favourite Hollywood go-to idea for established franchises, the origin story. Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins had recently shown that this could be a very successful way of resuscitating a tired franchise. Like Bond, Batman had needed some serious reinventing after Joel Schumacher's overblown comedies, so the character was relaunched in a darker, serious origin story, depicting the supposed creation of an already well-known and loved legend, a leaner, meaner, total reimagining of the franchise, and so Bond followed suit. In what seems to be an alternate universe, totally separate from the last 20 films, in 2006, we meet a young, newly promoted James Bond, who seems to be just starting out, and is very much an unfinished article, a careless, headstrong thug who does not always make the right decisions. Essentially a modern prequel, the film supplies knowing references to how Bond's famous hallmarks, the tuxedo, the Aston, the martini, all began. The only link reminding us of the previous films is, rather confusingly, Judi Dench's M, who has clearly been retained to reassure any skeptics, and this is just the beginning of Casino Royale's parallels with On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This Bond is not a quipping, ironic superhero, but, as Fleming described him, a blunt instrument. He is a very human and flawed assassin. There is a far greater attempt than usual to persuade us that Bond may not survive, putting him through far more physically and emotionally than we had seen for decades, as Eon gleefully returned to Fleming's cold-hearted anti-hero. As with Dalton, the tongue-in-cheek aspect is almost completely gone, but of course, even Craig's stony-faced Bond had to reintroduce some humour before not too long, as the cycle continued. Once again, like Connery, this Bond is classless. He is brutal, ballsy, and rough around the edges, decidedly less shiny than Brosnan, and some of his stunt work puts Roger Moore to shame. For the first time since Connery's early outings, we really do believe that this man could actually kill someone with his bare hands. Careless, immature, and cheeky, this Bond quickly shows his total disdain for authority, and crucially, he also makes mistakes. These qualities add up to give an impression of a more unformed figure than we have seen before, with harsh lessons to learn, but who might someday turn into the smooth operator we are familiar with. And so only at the film's end is he truly Bond James Bond, and worthy of the familiar theme tune. This version of the character is not only a force to be reckoned with, but, like Lazenby's Bond, is presented as being emotionally complex, questioning the morality of a job that leaves him with no soul left to salvage. This vulnerability makes Craig much more akin to the non-Superman of Fleming's books than any of Bond's previous filmic incarnations, and women are clearly targeted by Craig's Bond just as much as men. The scene where he comforts Vesper in the shower, instead of seducing her, as ironically he would be doing by Skyfall, illustrates that he truly cares for her, and the final sweeping act in Venice is extremely reminiscent of George Lazenby and Diana Rigg's "We Have All the Time in the World" montage, which would be referenced even more directly in Craig's final outing, No Time to Die. With Vesper's tragic death, Casino Royale clearly echoes 1969's downbeat New Hollywood ending. The difference this time, though, is that although the film delivers an emotional punch, it nonetheless sends us out of the cinema with a smile due to classic Bond's supposed birth in the final shot. As Craig's era continued, it marked Bond's first real opportunity for some character development, but it also bowed to the increasingly direct sequel-obsessed Hollywood machine, a style that would come to be defined in the following decade by the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where each new film can't help but feel like just the next episode of the world's most expensive TV show. Ironically, by attempting to continue the story of how James became Bond, Quantum of Solace moved even further away from Eon's established image than its predecessor. Even more conscious of being post-Dr. Evil, it desperately strives to de-Bondify itself even further and be taken seriously. Fan favourites such as the gun barrel sequence and the names Bond, James Bond are missing for the first time, totally stripping Bond of any iconic status, and the frantic editing pace just makes the action impossible to follow. 4 years later, seemingly feeling that the pendulum had swung too far away from traditional Bond, in 2012 Skyfall re-established the core characters of Moneypenny, Q, and a male M, and began the journey back towards quips and gadgets. So once again, despite all attempts to add plausibility, the series can't help but eventually become a checklist of its own conventions. Casino Royale's origin story status, and the direct sequels that followed it, doom this new timeline almost immediately to be a jigsaw of references from classic Bond films. This continued in Spectre, and now Bond's classic heritage is routinely paid tribute to in a series of in-jokes. In doing so, Craig's Bond era, rather like Disney's Star Wars saga, arguably morphed into not so much sequels, but almost tribute acts. It is a trend becoming more and more clear in modern cinema that the most valuable currency a long-running franchise can have is nostalgia for its earlier films. Taking the cue from Marvel that you can apparently no longer simply have a standalone adventure in a franchise, Spectre hastily attempted to tie up all of Craig's disjointed films together into one overarching storyline, which had clearly never been planned that way. Meanwhile, the trend that every mission must now be somehow personal to Bond, presumably to raise the stakes, is pushed almost to breaking point by reimagining arch-villain Blofeld to be a jealous step-sibling, which when compared to Austin Powers in Goldmember, almost parodies a parody. Which the filmmakers surely must have been aware of.
He's my brother, baby.
Also, a few sketches that Craig performed outside of the official films have even given us a glimpse of what his full-on parody Bond would look like.
Okay, give me an 8, give me an 8, give me an 8. 6, 2,
Permanently unsure if the Bond legacy is an embarrassment or an advantage, the Craig era often flip-flops over whether to abandon the formula and offer something fresh, or stick to the series' hallmarks again and again, and ultimately risk self-parody. No Time to Die continues this very difficult balancing act of the two extremes. In the wake of the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements, it is clear that this Bond is striving to appear bang up to date, while as usual also trying to appease the traditional fans with yet another deformed megalomaniac with a secret island lair. However, for the first time, because the filmmakers knew in advance that this was to be the actor's last film, this finally gives them the courage of their convictions to bravely push this more human, more soulful Bond to a logical conclusion. And as a result, we are given a Bond film that dares to deliver a clear ending for this version of the character. As such, Craig's era can be seen as the first fully self-contained Bond cycle, with a clear beginning and an end. You can see now that Bond's makers have an almost impossible task when creating each new film. Now that home VOD streaming is just as important to film studios as theatrical releases, bingeable direct sequels can seem very appealing. But with the gaps between Bond films getting longer, as they take more and more time and money to produce, it is harder than ever to make story arcs coherent and to stay relevant and up to date in the years it takes to get each new installment ready. Also, like many franchises, each new Bond film now seems to feel that it can no longer be just another throwaway installment, but must be an event, with celebrity directors, DPs, and composers now often brought in to add gravitas. The filmmakers also have the added pressure that the modern spy genre and its hallmarks are arguably served just as well by Tom Cruise and the Mission Impossible franchise, which, despite a few tonal shifts of its own, continues to mostly deliver the thrills and entertainment that traditionally Bond did, while in general never trying to be too completely serious for its own good. Now that we live in such a different era to the one in which Bond first started out in, it is worth questioning how or even if such a character can or should be modernised at all, especially as Fleming's original literary creation was certainly never intended to please everyone or to be a shiny role model. But as they always have done, the filmmakers want the character to appeal to the widest possible audience, and from the very start of the franchise, this has meant changes. So, some clear patterns continue. Bond is introduced to each generation as something slightly different through the chosen actor and therefore persona that the producers judge will be the most popular at any given time. Each new film then has a very difficult balancing act between two extremes, between serious and silly, between physical and technological, between nasty assassin and comical superhero, between fresh ideas or the safe repetition and in-jokes. The films are pulled in one direction by the duty to deliver yet another installment in a traditionally fun-filled yet predictable franchise, and in the other by a constant, almost anguished desire to be a standalone, unpredictable film exploring the psyche of a nasty, violent man who kills people. Each actor's first film will often begin with a Fleming-like physical and serious take on the role, but soon the weight of the Bond legacy adds too much pressure to fully maintain the initial tone set, and gradually, repetition and references to previous franchise hallmarks to reward the fans eventually pushes the character into something of a self-parody. Therefore, I think it's safe to say that each actor's first film as the character is usually their purest interpretation of it. After the parody element increases and gets to a bloated level of excess, the part is recast once again, the reset button is pushed, and a Fleming-like Purge brings the character back down to earth as we are presented with a slightly different, more modern version of the character, and the cycle begins again. As James Bond is a concept bigger than any one person, this rejuvenation can clearly continue indefinitely, each decade seeing a slightly different image projected onto Fleming's blank, tuxedo-wearing template. So, while Bond is the spy genre's traditional point of reference, and is still a synonym for it, he is in fact a changing point of reference. As we continue into uncertain times, perhaps Bond remains popular because we take comfort in a constantly refreshed but familiar character, a moving sign of the times and an eternally renewed pop icon. And that is why James Bond gets constantly reinvented.